going back to this model, this is the time to bring this on out now. So many fun things to kind of play with and to go with. But sagittal plane, we have pelvis that rotates, both of them, anterior, posterior. We have femur that flexes, we have femur that extends, we have right or left kind of side bend of the pelvis in the frontal plane. That is then going to be coupled with this anterior and this posterior translation. We have this right and we have this left and this right rotation that is coupled with the superior and this inferior kind of translation. So when it comes to movement, we need to think about both hips at the same time, how they're affecting each other, like left to right, right to left, bottom up and then top down as a driver, upper extremity as a driver, but then also using the lower extremity as a driver. We need to think about how these all are kind of tied in. When I have restrictions with patients and we're going through our FMR techniques and or we're showing you some of these self-FMR techniques, it's to go after sequentially all 6 of those combinations. We're going to first integrate the combination of those two, either the rotation or the translation, that same plane. Again, let's take the sagittal plane for the rotation, anterior and posterior, flexion and extension of the femur, but we're going to couple that with our frontal plane, our side-to-side translation. So we need to, in terms of assessing, in terms of treating, in terms of reassessing and providing home exercise programs for patients, people like yourself, we need to think about how, when we're using our hands, what are we feeling, what's limited, what's restricted, and how can we drive and facilitate motion that is not evident by what we're feeling or should be getting with our hands. And taking the task and the skill. Is it walking? Is it running? Is it swinging a bat? Is it swinging a golf club? Is it picking up a child? Is it putting something up in the glass away from the cupboard? Or is it putting something away in the freezer? Is it raking the yard? Is it bending down, kind of kneeling position and kind of pulling weeds? We need to think about how this is affecting us side to side. We need to think about all 6 of those kind of, or those 3 kind of combinations, those 6 kind of combinations of rotations and translations, and how that's all happening at the same time in each hip. So what I would like to propose, and what I've thought for many years now, is that when it comes to, actually I'm not done with this yet, when it comes to position of our feet, when it comes to function, nothing that we ever do has anything to do with our feet perfectly parallel. And if it does, think about the implications for the rotation and the translation for all 6 kind of combos here is getting diminished and shut off. So for myself personally, in terms of, and a lot of my patients, I've completely eliminated all those kind of parallel squat, parallel push-up kind of segments of things, because now when I start to stagger my feet, well, now in terms of the alteration of that and kind of the staggering, I really facilitate the transverse plane, which is the big driver throughout our entire system. I think we need to think about, in terms of how we're treating and what we're doing, not using that parallel like stance for what we're doing, because it completely diminishes and helps take away from what's driven into those other kind of rotation and translational kind of angulatory kind of planes right here. If I take away the transverse plane, then you know what, hey, I'm playing with sagittal and I'm playing with kind of frontal. Let's think about the implications for that in terms of transverse plane, no staggering of the feet. I'm getting it's taken away from that inferior kind of translation that I should be getting as the center of gravity gets closer to the ground. But then let's also take a look at this when we talk about relative motion. When we talk about real motion, what bones are doing, relative motion, what bones are doing in relation to each other to give us relative joint motion. What about kind of in this, that transverse plane kind of right and left rotation, that inferior and that superior kind of translation, in terms of, hey, we're always driven down to the ground, which is the case until we propel on out, and then we're being mushed back to the ground again. But what about a relative kind of, it's always distal in relation to proximal when it comes to extremities. I've always fought for in the terms of, hey, the higher up the chain that we get, it's like cutting down a tree. It's like chopping down that tree. So so that when it starts to tip on over, the last thing that you want to do is start running from this tree. When it tips on over, stay close to the trunk so that you can quickly kind of dodge things. So initially, yes, everything collapses from the bottom up and is driven and facilitated from there, and top-down drivers from the upper extremity, but to a point, things from the bottom up start to slow down and things from the top down start to speed on up. Stretch, compression, and tension proprioceptively kind of driving that feedback for us. We need to think about how we have inferior translations, but then also superior translations from the bottom up to kind of mush this chain reaction effect of co-contractions, compression, congruency, approximation to drive and facilitate this chain reaction of dynamic joint stabilization, proprioceptive feedback of stretch, compression, and tension that's continued through the chain as things continue to load and unload. There's my spill in relation to how, in regards to the relationship of the femur rotating and translating in reference to the pelvis's rotation and translation to give us relative motion, to keep us happy, free, and using these hips as these big, powerful cannonball shifts is what they are. Play around with those kind of concepts a little bit, guys, in your mind and reflect on them. We have a lot to come in terms of exercise activities, self-FMR techniques that are going to help drive and rotate all these rotation and translation concepts. Epic stuff. Thank you to a great mentor, Gary Gray and David Tibiero from the Gray Institute, and in our fellowship program, Applied Functional Science, Fellowship of Applied Functional Science, in GIFT, Gray Institute for Functional Transformation. Great help from those guys, and a great kind of encouragement for them to us to snowball this, to get this ball rolling, to keep these epic, primal concepts of the movement sciences and biological truths alive.